Why MMOs are dying and why live service and survival games replace them, in my opinion. For a long time, MMOs were a dream, not just games and worlds, places where your characters wasn't just a build, it was your identity. You didn't play MMOs for a quick session. You planned your night around it. You remembered the server names. You remembered the rival guilds. You remember the people who helped you and who didn't. MMOs weren't just entertainment. They were social spaces before social spaces were normal in games. And for years, if you wanted that feeling, that sense of scale, persistence, and shared experience, MMOs were the only place that you could get it. But somewhere along the way, the magic started to fade. Today, the new MMO launches barely causes a ripple. Games announce ambitious roadmaps only to quietly scale them back, or server merges, or updates slow. They eventually just shut down. Notice appears, and often more silence than ceremony. What's strange is that the players never stop talking about MMOs. We reminisce about the golden ages of it. We still ask, why doesn't anyone else make a game like this anymore? But when a new MMO actually arrives, most players bounce off within weeks, sometimes days. And that's the part worth examining. Because it's not that players stop wanting shared worlds. It's not that people suddenly hate progression, community, or persistence. Those things didn't disappear. They just moved. MMOs didn't collapse because players rejected the idea of living worlds. They collapsed because the other games figured out how to deliver the feeling of an MMO without the friction, the time demands, and the outdated design assumptions. Live service games took the social loop. Survival games took the living world fantasy. And both of them learned how to fit them into a modern lives in a way that MMOs never really fully did. This isn't a video about MMOs are bad now, and it's not nostalgia bait. This is about how MMOs lost their monopoly on something they once owned, and why the games that they replaced them didn't feel like a replacement at all. They felt like an evolution. Now, MMOs used to be the only place you could get the experience. There was a time when MMOs weren't just a genre, they were the only option. If you wanted a game that felt alive after you logged off, or if you wanted a world that changed whether you were there or not, if you wanted to feel like a player inside something much bigger, MMOs were it. They were the only games that offered persistent worlds that didn't reset when you quit, players' identity that followed you everywhere, long-term progression measured in months or years, social dependency baked into the design, community reputation that actually mattered. Nothing else came close. Single-player games ended, multiplayer shooters reset every match, and lobbies-based games erased everything when the session was over. MMOs, they were different. When you logged out, the world kept going. Your guild kept raiding. The economy kept shifting. Territory changed hands. Drama happened without you. Logging back in felt like a returning to a place, not booting up a product. And that persistence changed how players behaved. Your character name mattered because you couldn't hide behind matchmaking. If you were helpful, people remembered. If you were toxic, people remember that as well. Servers weren't just technical infrastructures. They were communities. You recognized names in chat. You knew who controlled which dungeon spawns. You knew which guild dominated PvP and which ones always collapsed right before endgame. Progression was slow, but then the slowness created meaning. Levels weren't numbers, they were milestones. Gears wasn't cosmetics, it was proof. Time invested showed your characters were in visible, tangible ways. And most importantly, MMOs required players to rely on each other. You needed tanks. You needed healers and crafters. You needed information. There were no instant queues. There was no universal fast travel. There was no play however you want safety nets. If you wanted to succeed, you talked to people. You negotiated. You compromised. That friction, that thing that modern design tries so hard to eliminate, was what created bonds. World of Warcraft, EverQuest, Star Wars Galaxies, Final Fantasy. These games didn't just give content, they gave context. You weren't the hero of the story. You were one name amongst thousands of people trying to carve out a space, and that made everything feel earned. MMOs didn't respect your time, they demanded it. And strangely enough, that demand made the experience feel valuable, because when everything takes effort, everything carries weight. That was the experience. And for a long time, there was nowhere else to find it. The problem is that MMOs became too big to feel personal. MMOs didn't lose their soul at once. They optimized it in a way. As the genre grew more popular, studios chased scale, more players, more content, more accessibility, more retention. On paper, that made sense. MMOs are expensive, servers aren't cheap, and content pipelines demand constant output. So design priorities shifted. Instead of asking, how does this world feel? The question became, how many players can be onboarded? And that's where things started to break. MMOs slowly transformed into theme parks. You didn't explore, you followed paths. You didn't discover, you unlocked. You didn't wander, you optimized. Design leaned harder into linear quest hubs, fast leveling curves, daily and weekly checklists, instant heavy content, end game first design. The journey stopped being the game, and the destination became everything. Leveling turned into tutorial. You rushed through it. Zones became temporary backdrops. Story beats were consumed once and discarded. Cities, once social hubs, became functional lobbies. Players stood in circles waiting for queue pops. Chat scrolled by unread and impersonal. You were surrounded by thousands of people, and yet somehow it felt completely alone. Crossover matchmaking meant names stopped mattering. Dungeon groups formed and dissolved in silence. Why talk when you'll never see these people again? Guilds changed, too. They stopped being survival mechanisms and became scheduled tools. You didn't join a guild to belong, you joined to access content. Voice chat replaced in-game persistence to Discord replaced the world. The MMOs stopped being the place where relationships formed. It became the place where you logged in after you already knew people. And the world itself stopped reacting to players. Zones didn't change, factions didn't remember you, and the choices didn't ripple outward. The game didn't care who you were, only how fast you were progressing. Everything became smoother, cleaner, safer. But that safety came at a cost. When nothing slows you down, nothing sticks. When everyone progresses the same way, no one stands out. And when failure is impossible, success feels hollow. MMOs didn't die because they got worse in making content. They died because they stopped making places. And players noticed, even if they couldn't even quite explain why. Meanwhile, other game genres learned the lesson. While MMOs were busy trying to fix their problems from the inside, other genres were watching from the outside. They weren't trying to replace MMOs. They weren't chasing subscriptions or massive concurrent populations. They were asking simpler, more dangerous questions like, what parts of the MMO do players actually love? And which parts do they just only tolerate? So while MMOs doubled down on daily login rewards, weekly lockouts, seasonal resets, and engagement-driven checklists, other genres quietly begin stripping those systems apart. They took the feel of MMO, persistent identity, shared spaces, long-term goals, and rebuilt them in a smaller, more flexible formats. Games stopped asking to live in one world forever. They started asking players to return. Progression became modular. Sessions became optional, and commitment became flexible. And here's the key difference. Other genres didn't assume players would reorganize their lives around the game. They designed for interruption. Miss a week? That's fine. Miss a season? You can catch up. Drop off for months, and your character still makes sense when you come back and play. MMOs, by contrast, kept designing for permanence. Even as players' lives became more fragmented, live service and survival games learned that social friction isn't always good. And that's sometimes the strongest communities when people choose to show up, not when they're required to. They also learned something that MMOs struggled with. You didn't need infinite content if the systems create stories on their own. Instead of feeding players handcrafted quests, they give them the tools. Instead of narrating importance, they allow importance to emerge. And slowly, and most quietly, the ideas that once defined MMOs stopped belonging exclusively to them. The genre didn't collapse, it was outpaced. But the games understood what MMOs experience meant, even if they never called themselves MMOs. Now, live service games took the MMO social loop. They took the loop, that part that actually keeps people coming back. Games like Destiny, Warframe, Division, Sea of Thieves, they all look very different traditional MMOs on the surface. Smaller worlds, fewer players, per space, shorter sessions, but underneath, the psychological is almost identical. You log in, you make progress, you show off that progress to other players, you log out feeling that your time was mattered. That loop, that progression, that identity, that recognition that used to belong exclusively to MMOs, live service games just made it lighter. Progression is broken into clearer, digestible chunks. You don't need to spreadsheet to understand what you're doing next. You don't need to grind for weeks before the game gets good. You can just jump in for 30 minutes, complete something meaningful, and then leave. That matters more than developers want to admit. Socially, these games lower the barrier without removing the connection. You still play with others. You still cooperate. You still recognize names, especially with clans, crews, and fire teams. But you're not locked in. No rigid class trinity, no mandatory raid schedules, no expectations that the game becomes your second job. And crucially, live service games understood modern identity. Cosmetics matter, loadouts matter, titles, emblems, and achievements matter. They give players the visible proof of investment, the same way a rare mount or raid gear once did in MMOs, but without forcing everyone down the same path. Updates arrive regularly, but they don't demand obedience. You encourage to check in, but not punish for checking out. You miss a season, you might lose a cosmetic or two, but the character doesn't become obsolete. Compare that to MMOs. Where you're missing an expansion, the patches can make you feel permanently behind. Live service games flip that relationship. The game works around your life. MMOs still expect their life to work around the game. And once players experienced that difference, it became very hard to go back. Live service games didn't kill MMOs. They just answered the question MMOs kept dodging. What if progression felt good without demanding everything? Then there's open world survival games, took the MMO, living world fantasy. If live service games replace the social loop of MMOs, then open world survival games replace something even more important, the feeling that the world exists with or without you. Games like Rust, Ark, Valheim, Conan Exiles, DayZ don't present themselves as MMOs. They don't promise epic narrative, handcrafted quest lines. What they do offer, though, instead, is something older and rarer, a world that doesn't care about you. There's no one choosing one story, no destiny waiting to unfold, no NPC reminding you on how important you are. You start weak, cold, hungry, and often naked and alone. And from that moment forward, everything that matters is player created. There are no quest markers telling you where the story is. The story happens when players collide. A base on the horizon isn't a set dressing, it's a threat. A stranger approaching isn't a quest giver, it's a decision point. The constant uncertainty is something MMOs slowly erased in the name of accessibility. Survival games brought it back. They create emergent narratives, stories that aren't written by developers but remembered by players. Your base getting raided at 3 a.m.? That story you'll retell for years. Your tribe splintering after a leadership fight? That's server history. A rival group controlling a region or taxing everyone else? That's politics. And unlike theme park MMOs, those stories persist. Right? The world changes because of players. Structures rise and fall, territories shift hands, and power vacuums appear. Nothing resets neatly. That's the key difference. In modern MMOs, the world waits for players to arrive, performs, and then snaps back into place. In a survival game, the world remembers. They also reintroduce something that MMOs quietly abandon. Risk with consequences. Death hurts. Loss is real, and gear doesn't magically reappear. You feel fear again. Not because the boss hits hard, but because the other players are unpredictable. That unpredictability creates meaning. You don't need 500 quests when one night of survival creates memories stronger than any scripted arc. And all of that happens without subscription fees, mega servers, cross-realm sharing, and theme parks on rails. Survival games don't ask you to grind content. They ask you to exist. And in doing so, they actually became the closest thing to old-school MMOs that modern game has. Not because they copied the genre, but because they remembered what made them magical in the first place. Then there's the in-between games that quietly replaced MMOs as well. Not every MMO replaced fits neatly into this live service or survival. There's a third category, games that live somewhere in the middle. The Fallout 76s, the No Man's Skies, the Minecraft, the Hytale now. On the surface, these games look widely different. Different mechanics, different audiences, different scope. But they all scratch the same itch. MMOs used to dominate. They offer shared worlds without rigid obligations. Fallout 76 isn't an MMO in any traditional sense, but it gives players something modern MMOs struggle with. A persistent world that reacts to players' persistence without demanding constant participation. You can log in alone. You can team up spontaneously. You can help strangers without ever joining a guild. There's no raid schedule. There's no daily pressure. There's no fear of falling behind. And yet, your character still exists in a shared space, with stories emerging in random encounters, player trading, and cooperative events. No Man's Sky took this even further. It didn't even try to be a social hub. It didn't try to funnel players into a group content. Instead, it built this universe that feels impossibly vast and let communities happen naturally. Players discover planets, name creatures. They build bases others might stumble upon weeks later. You're alone, but you're never really isolated. That sense of that connection is something MMOs almost never explored. Minecraft might be the most overlooked MMO successor of all. It has persistent worlds, player-driven economies, social dependency, server identity, and emergent storytelling within the game, right? Yes, there are mods and stuff like that, but all without the quest, the levels, or classes. Private servers become communities. Public servers become societies. Rules are enforced socially, not mechanically. Reputation matters again. Minecraft doesn't tell you how to play. It gives you the box and asks you what kind of world you want. The freedom is exactly what early MMOs promised before systems got in the way. And then there's Hytale, the game that just came out and that hasn't launched yet, but it's in early access, but already represents where the evolution is heading. Hytale isn't positioning itself as a traditional MMO. It's positioning itself as a platform. It's modding, player-created servers, custom rule sets. It's less, here's our world, and more, build yours. And that's not an accident. It's a recognition that most memorable MMO moments were never developer-authored. They were player-made. These games succeeded where modern MMOs struggle because they don't demand lifelong commitment. They allow solo play without penalty, social interactions without obligation, and long-term worlds current content treadmills. They don't replace MMOs mechanically. They don't replace them philosophically. They understand that the modern players don't want to be managed. They want to belong on their own terms. So why do players prefer these games now more than MMOs? The biggest change didn't happen in game design, it happened in players' lives. The audience grew up on EverQuest, WoW, Star Wars Galaxies, Ultima Online. They're older now. They have jobs, families, responsibilities, limited, fragmented time. Modern players don't sit down asking, how can I spend my entire weekend in one game? They ask, what can I enjoy right now? And that's where MMOs started to fall behind. MMOs still assume the level of availability that no longer exists. They reward consistency over intention, persistence over engagement, and attendance over enjoyment. MMOs also lost their risk. Old school MMOs were dangerous, man, in the best way possible. Death wasn't just a screen fade. It meant running back for your corpse, losing progress, and risking gear. A mistake could have long-lasting consequences. Your actions could hurt or help other players. Your reputation wasn't a number. It was a living memory. Remembering logging into Ultima Online and seeing someone killed in town, or dying in EverQuest after one long run, losing hours of progress, that fear, that tension made victories feel real. Every dungeon, every raid, every PvP encountered carried stakes. You felt the world, and players remembered it. They told stories about it for years. They're still telling stories about it. Those stories are what gave MMOs their legendary status. Modern MMOs slowly removed that risk. Death became temporary. Gear could be replaced in minutes. Failing a raid didn't hurt the player, it just hurt your timer. PvP became optional and heavy-gated. Economics were stabilized. Consequences were softened for accessibility. Nothing was permanent, nothing was scary, nothing truly mattered, and at least not the way it used to. And this is the subtle reason why MMO veterans log out and don't come back. People don't remember balanced systems. They remember emotional experiences, the tension of the real threat, the thrill of achieving something under pressure, the joy of narrowly surviving a disaster. Survival games brought risk back in spades. In Rust, your base can be raided while you're offline. In DayZ, the death can mean losing everything in a single encounter. In Ark, predators attack on hostile players, turn every journey into a story. Even in live service games like Destiny, the progression loop matters because falling behind has immediate consequences. You don't earn that loot if you don't participate. Risk creates meaning. Without risk, accomplishments feel hollow. Without stakes, social interactions feel weightless. MMOs try to please everyone, and they wanted to be safe and casual for players and accessible for new players, and they wanted to avoid frustration at all costs. And in that process, they removed the emotion, the very thing that made players care. Survival games didn't apologize for danger. Live service games don't apologize for a rewarding commitment, and MMOs try to neutralize both. And this is why the thrill, the tension, the stakes, and the very reason people use to dedicate years to a world are now being found somewhere else. Why WoW, Final Fantasy, and ESO still survive? Let's be clear, MMOs aren't gone, but some of the giants from the genre still exist. World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, and Elder Scrolls Online remain active to millions of players logging in every day. World of Warcraft survives because it's a phenom of legacy. It has decades of history, lore, brand recognition, right? Newer MMOs can't touch. The player base might not be growing explosively, but WoW's sheer volume of content keeps players coming back. Raids, dungeons, expansions, events. There's always something to do, and the sheer size of the world creates immersion. Even as a genre evolved around it, WoW adapted just enough to maintain relevance across realm grouping. The game doesn't need to renovate itself. It just needs to manage the ecosystems built for over 20 years. Final Fantasy's narrative is trust. Final Fantasy succeeds differently because where WoW relies on content volume, Final Fantasy relies on storytelling and community trust. The narrative is strong, emotional, and ongoing. Players log in to expense the next chapter of the living saga. The community is welcoming, structured, and reliable, not perfect, but far more manageable than older MMOs with fragmented social systems. And unlike the other MMOs, Final Fantasy listens to its players. Bug fixes, quality of life updates, and even designs show respect to player feedback. That trust makes players feel like the world is alive, and they care for them, not just in the content machine. ESO is accessible and solo-friendly. Elder Scrolls Online survive by doing what MMOs don't remove: friction. You can play it solo. You can join a friend. You can also skip certain mechanics entirely and still feel meaningful progression. ESO doesn't demand the hardcore raider to feel like a hero. It doesn't punish you for the life obligations and sporadic play. It world adapts for pace, your style, and your choices. By balancing the solo flexibility of MMO-style multiplayer content, ESO appeals to players who crave world persistence without feeling trapped by it. The common thread, notice the pattern. These games refine their niche. Instead of chasing everyone, they preserve what works: risk, social loops, identity, while smoothing over modern barriers. But here's the catch. None of them are growing explosively. They're maintaining, sustaining, holding on to relevance because their foundations were strong. They're survived not by re-renovating the MMOs, but by perfecting what the genre used to do best and avoiding the mistakes that doomed newer MMOs. In other words, survival's don't mean that they're thriving. They're proof that MMOs can work, but only if they don't try to please everyone at once. New MMOs launched into a very different world than they once did when they welcomed EverQuest or early World of Warcraft. Back then, players were willing to invest months, even years, to reach the end game, learn the systems, build social networks. Today, patience is scarce, and the options are endless. When new MMOs arrive, it faces competitors on multiple fronts. Meanwhile, alternatives let players jump in for a weekend and feel accomplished, drop out and return later without losing relevance, or explore social play on their own terms. It's a brutal contrast. It's a psychological shift. Players today want rewards without frustration, choices without punishment, or stories that emerge organically. New MMOs often deliver forced grind loops, time-gated content, punishing catch-up mechanics, and complex progressions that isn't transparent. Even if the world is massive or beautiful, these design choices alternate modern audiences. The marketing versus reality is that there's other challenges hype. The new MMO launched with massive marketing campaigns, promises that it's the next World of Warcraft, and high expectations. And when content fails to match the hype, even in small ways, communities fracture quickly. Early burnout, negative reviews, and streamers' abandonment snowball. And unlike old MMOs, these games cannot rely on nostalgia for massive pre-existing fan bases to survive. The hard truth? It's not the new MMOs that inherently are bad. It's that their strengths are copied elsewhere. Social loops, persistent worlds, progressions, built in modern, flexible ways. Their weakness remains. The grind, the rigid systems, the long onboarding, and the barriers are higher than ever. Time commitment, risk, and trust. Players don't just vote with their words anymore. They vote with their time. And if a game asks for too much, they leave that before it even has a chance to grow. New MMOs aren't failing because there's no desire for them. They're failing because other games learn the lessons of MMOs without their baggage, and then the players move on. MMOs used to be a place where you lived, not just spaces that you logged into, but worlds that shaped your daily life. Worlds where the choices mattered and your friendships endured, and your victories and defeats became part of your story. You weren't just a player. You were a citizen, a participant, and a hero. And remember them. Meanwhile, MMOs stand on a crossroad. Until they reclaim the space once owned, the space of risk, persistence, and player-driven narratives, they'll continue to fade quietly. Not because the audience has lost interest, not because the MMOs are irrelevant, but because players found better worlds elsewhere. The question now is simple. Will MMOs evolve and reclaim their place as worlds you lived in? Or will they remain relics, admired in history, but abandoned by experiences modern players already crave? Until someone answers that, players will keep seeking adventure, connections, and risk, just somewhere other than the traditional MMO. If you enjoyed this breakdown, go ahead and hit that like button. Seriously, it helps more than you think. And it tells me that you want more deep dives like this. And I want to hear from you. Do you think MMOs are truly dying? Or are you just waiting for the next game to reclaim the magic? Maybe there's survival or live service games you think nails the MMO feeling better than any modern MMO do. Let me know in the comment section down below. Your thoughts and experience and examples make these discussions way more interesting, so drop them below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
Welcome to the world that never ends. Run, escape, open doors and no one. Browse a world.